June 14, 1944. Saipan, 11:23 in the morning. The sound was the first thing that hit Takeshi Yamamoto. Not the sight, but the sound. A sharp crack, almost musical, crisp and distinct from the endless percussion of combat. Wood meeting leather. Then a roar, cheering, laughter, American laughter. The kind of laughter he had not heard directed toward anything other than mockery or cruelty for so long that he had forgotten what unselfconscious joy sounded like. Yamamoto was 26 years old, a lance corporal in the Imperial Japanese Army's 31st Infantry Regiment. 3 hours earlier, he had been crouched in a bunker with 15 other soldiers, listening to their sergeant tell them they would fight to the last man, that surrender meant eternal dishonor, that the Americans would torture and kill anyone fool enough to drop his weapon. 5 hours before that, the American artillery had begun its systematic erasure of the regiment. What remained of Yamamoto's company was fragments. A corporal with burns on his left side, a young private who had not spoken since the bombardment started, another soldier whose arm hung uselessly, and who moved like a man waking from a dream he could not quite remember leaving. When the Americans came, they came in overwhelming numbers, moving through the rubble with the methodical purpose of men who had already won and were simply executing the conclusion. Yamamoto's sergeant had ordered a final banzai charge. Yamamoto had not moved. He realized in that moment, tired. Tired of dying in installments, tired of hunger, tired of fear. When the American soldiers reached the bunker's entrance, weapons raised and faces set in expressions of professional readiness, Yamamoto had walked out with his hands raised, moving slowly because sudden movements had become dangerous and because part of him still expected to be shot where he stood. The Americans had not shot him. They had disarmed him, searched him with businesslike efficiency, secured his hands loosely with rope, and directed him toward the rear with a gesture that required no translation. Behind him, his sergeant had ordered the others to throw their grenades. Yamamoto heard the explosions as he walked. He did not look back. Now, hours later, secured in a temporary holding pen with 30 other prisoners in what had been a Japanese supply depot, he heard that sound again. That crack, that cheer, that laughter. He moved to the fence line and peered through the gap between the planks. What he saw was incomprehensible. 20 meters away, on a rough field that had been cleared among the debris and rubble, American soldiers were playing baseball. The diamond itself seemed impossible. In a landscape of destruction and blood and dust, someone had taken the effort to measure a precise square, to mark it with lime powder that glowed white against the dark earth. 2 teams in makeshift uniforms, one group wearing undyed cloth bands around their arms, the other wearing cloth bands dyed red with berry juice or paint or some other substance Yamamoto could not identify, moved in an organized formation. An American soldier, stripped to the waist in the Pacific heat, stood in the center holding a baseball bat. Another stood behind him in a squat position, glove extended. 2 more stood at distant positions in the field. Behind the catcher, perhaps 50 American soldiers sat on the ground or stood watching, their weapons stacked carefully to the side, their full attention focused on the game. For a moment, Yamamoto did not understand what he was witnessing. His entire military education had been constructed around one principle. In war, every moment not devoted to the mission was wasteful, potentially suicidal, a luxury that only the weak-minded indulged. Soldiers did not rest unless ordered. They did not relax. They did not play games while engaged in active operations. Such behavior was contemptible, a sign of poor discipline and deteriorating unit cohesion. Yet here were these Americans, engaged in active combat operations against an enemy that had not yet completely surrendered, playing a game. The pitcher wound up and released the ball. The motion was casual, almost negligent. The batter swung, a full rotation of his shoulders and hips that seemed to put the entire weight of his body behind the movement. The crack of contact came again, sharp and distinct. The ball flew upward and outward, traveling far into the open field. The watching soldiers erupted in sound. Not the controlled, coordinated sound of trained men, but genuine, spontaneous excitement. Voices overlapped. Some cheered for the batter, others shouted advice to the fielders. One man stood up and waved his arms in a pattern that seemed designed to encourage or distract. Yamamoto could not tell which. A fielder, a tall soldier with pale hair visible beneath his helmet, turned and ran toward the descending ball. He ran with the careless speed of a man who had not been forced to calculate every movement, who did not view space and motion as resources to be allocated against uncertain threats. As he ran, he grinned. Yamamoto saw his teeth flash in the tropical sunlight. The ball came down. The fielder's glove came up. The catch was made. The crowd erupted again. The fielder raised his glove high, showing the captured ball to the other soldiers. He did not remove it immediately to show off the trophy. Instead, he brought it to his mouth and bit it, a gesture so absurd and undisciplined that Yamamoto felt something shift in his understanding of what discipline meant, or could mean, or whether it meant anything at all. On the other side of the fence, unnoticed by the watching prisoners, tears had begun running down Takeshi Yamamoto's face. 3 months later, at a processing facility in California, Yamamoto described this moment to a Japanese interrogator who had been retained by the Americans to conduct initial interviews with Japanese prisoners. The interrogator was himself a complicated figure, a second-generation Japanese-American educated in America, who had lived in San Francisco before the war and had been drafted into the Army Signal Corps specifically to work with prisoners. His name was Robert Nakagawa, though he went by Bob when speaking to Americans, and the contradiction in his identity, caught between two nations that were fighting for their very survival, had created a philosophical abyss that no amount of military rank could bridge. When Yamamoto described the baseball game, Nakagawa's face had gone carefully neutral in the way trained interpreters learn to maintain. But Yamamoto had seen his eyes flicker with recognition, with something deeper than mere professional interest. When the interrogation concluded, Nakagawa had pulled out a piece of American chocolate and given it to Yamamoto, a gesture that violated protocol, that was technically against regulations, but that communicated something that Yamamoto understood instinctively, that what he had witnessed on Saipan had mattered, that it meant something, that he was not crazy for having been profoundly shaken by the sight of enemies playing a children's game in the middle of a war. Yamamoto was eventually transferred to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where approximately 4,000 Japanese prisoners of war were being held in relative security, far from any Pacific combat theater. The camp had been hastily constructed in 1943, with barbed wire fences, guard towers, and a central compound that housed administration and medical facilities. Beyond this, standard military barracks had been erected in neat rows, each capable of holding 50 to 100 prisoners depending on assignment and apparent threat level. By the time Yamamoto arrived in September 1944, the camp had begun to develop its own social structure, its own internal hierarchy, its own ways of understanding and navigating captivity. The first thing that struck Yamamoto upon arrival was the smell. Not the smell of a prison camp, the fetid human odor that came from inadequate sanitation and inadequate bathing. Instead, what he smelled was cleanliness. Pine soap, water, recently cut grass. The smell of order and maintenance. In the Japanese military, cleanliness had been enforced with brutality, but even brutally enforced cleanliness in a tropical war zone could not overcome the fundamental realities of disease and rot and the breakdown of the body. Here, everything seemed carefully controlled. His health did not improve quickly. The experience of combat, of bombing, of the collapse of his unit had left physical and psychological marks that food and clean water alone could not erase. He had dysentery. He had infections from shrapnel wounds that had never been properly treated. He had something that the American doctors called combat fatigue, though Yamamoto called it the sensation of his mind moving through water, every thought requiring enormous effort. But over the following weeks and months, imperceptibly at first and then with growing insistence, his body began to recover. The infections cleared. The dysentery resolved. The weight came back to his frame. His energy, which had been a dim thing requiring constant coaxing just to achieve minimal function, began to surge. It was during this period in October 1944 that he first encountered the American soldiers playing baseball. Unlike on Saipan, where the game had been a shocking intrusion into the machinery of active warfare, here the baseball field was an established feature of the camp. It was, Yamamoto learned through a combination of gestures and the sparse English he had begun to acquire, regularly maintained. Games were scheduled. Teams were organized. The entire camp, both prisoners and American guards, seemed to treat these games with a significance that far exceeded their actual military or strategic value. Yamamoto's initial response was confusion, deepening into something like cultural shock. In his experience, soldiers did one of two things: they trained or they fought. Training was brutal and purposeful. Fighting was desperate and terrifying. There was no space in between for enjoyment, for pleasure, for the casual assertion that life should include things that had no purpose beyond the pleasure they provided. Yet here were American soldiers, standing in the tropical heat wearing incomplete uniforms and smiling. Smiling. Not the thin, sharp smiles of men plotting or scheming or appreciating cruelty, but open smiles, genuine ones. They would swing bats with full force as if they genuinely believed they would hit the ball, as if they had not internalized the lessons that Japanese military training had beaten into every fiber. That confidence was weakness, that ease led to death, that the only certainty was suffering and the path to honor was through accepting that suffering without complaint. What disturbed Yamamoto most was not what the American soldiers did, but how other prisoners reacted to it. Within weeks of arriving at Camp Shelby, Yamamoto discovered that the Japanese prisoners had begun to engage in their own baseball games, using equipment purchased or constructed through unclear channels, using spaces within the compound that had been cleared and prepared. The prisoners had created a baseball league. A Japanese lieutenant named Katsubara, a man of perhaps 30 with the bearing of someone from an educated military family, had organized the effort. He approached Yamamoto one afternoon after the American soldiers had finished their game, while the field was still being used by prisoners who wanted to practice or simply occupy their time with something more interesting than sitting in their barracks. "You should play," Katsubara said in Japanese. "We need another outfielder." Yamamoto's first instinct was to refuse, to sit in the barracks to conserve his energy, to maintain the posture of dignified suffering that seemed appropriate for a prisoner of war. But something had shifted in him since witnessing the game on Saipan. Some structure inside him had cracked, permitting alternatives to enter. He picked up a baseball bat that Katsubara handed him. The weight was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. The Americans' bats were made of a wood that was harder and more closely grained than anything Yamamoto had ever handled. Everything about it seemed designed for a different kind of relationship with the world, one in which joy and force were connected, in which strength could be used for purposes other than inflicting suffering. The first time Yamamoto stepped up to bat, in a game between the Eagles, his assigned team, and the Tigers, their rivals, he struck out. The pitcher, another prisoner named Sasaki who had played semi-professional baseball in Hiroshima before the war, threw 3 pitches that Yamamoto made no real effort to connect with. The experience was humbling in a way that military training had never quite achieved. Humbling in that it was entirely self-contained, not connected to life or death or honor or national prestige. He simply failed at a game. When he walked back to the dugout, a concept he had to learn, since the Japanese military had no equivalent term, some of his teammates laughed at him. Not with malice, but with the easy mockery of men who shared an experience and could afford to acknowledge its absurdity. Yamamoto realized that for the first time in months, perhaps in years, he was among men who could laugh together about something that was not another's pain. By November 1944, Yamamoto had become a regular player on the Eagles team. He was not particularly talented. His batting average was below the team mean, but he was consistent. And in a camp where every moment was marked by the psychological weight of captivity and uncertain future, consistency itself became valuable. He played. He did not play well, but he played. And in playing, he was participating in something that had no justification beyond itself, no purpose beyond the purpose of being alive in a moment rather than being dead. The American soldiers who guarded the camp watched these games with considerable interest. According to regulations set down from the camp commander, American soldiers could not play directly against Japanese prisoners. But they could attend the games. They could watch. And in watching, something of the barrier between captor and captive seemed to soften in ways that neither side quite understood. One American soldier, a private named Harold Greenberg from Detroit, whose father owned a baseball team in the Negro Leagues, a detail that made him complex in ways the camp's rigid racial system struggled to accommodate, developed a particular interest in the prisoner games. He attended frequently, sitting on the fence line, calling out encouragement in a manner that violated no standing orders, but that seemed to operate in a space that those orders had not anticipated. When Yamamoto hit his first home run, a poorly connected swing that went high and short, landing in fair territory by accident rather than design, Greenberg had stood up and clapped. A slow, deliberate series of 3 claps that communicated something that transcended the game itself. Recognition of an achievement, acknowledgement of another human being's momentary triumph, a suggestion that the categories of enemy and prisoner could be suspended for at least that moment. Yamamoto had looked at Greenberg. Greenberg had nodded. No words were exchanged. No words were possible since Greenberg spoke only English, and Yamamoto's English was still minimal. But something had passed between them nonetheless. A recognition that both belonged to a species that played games, that found meaning in contests whose outcome was genuinely meaningless, that could locate profound joy in the most trivial of achievements. That moment, that nod, stayed with Yamamoto for the rest of his captivity. It became, in retrospect, the moment when he understood something essential about American society that no amount of propaganda could have communicated. The Americans were not weak because they played baseball. They were not decadent or soft or lacking in the virtues that Japanese military training emphasized. But they had organized their society around different principles. They had created a culture in which a man could hit a ball into a field and be celebrated, not because he had conquered an enemy or proven his superiority, but simply because he had, in that moment, executed something difficult reasonably well. This principle seemed to extend to almost everything in the American POW camps, though Yamamoto did not fully appreciate this until later, when he had time to reflect on the full scope of what he had encountered. The camps were, compared to what Japanese prisoners had been told to expect, and compared to what Japanese camps offered to their prisoners, extraordinarily comfortable. Food was adequate. Water was clean. Medical care was available. The guards were, by and large, professional and occasionally even kind. But what distinguished American captivity from what Japanese military culture had imagined was not these material factors, though they were important. What distinguished it was the presence of choice and the validation of pleasure. The American system, even in its carceral form, seemed to operate on the principle that men could be productive and obedient without being kept in absolute misery. That morale could be maintained through positive incentives rather than solely through fear of punishment. That a society was strengthened, not weakened, by creating space for men to play baseball when their work was done. The Imperial Japanese Army had understood fear. It had understood hierarchy. It had understood how to take men and remake them into fighting machines through the systematic application of suffering, shame, and the promise of glorious death. What it had not understood, or perhaps what it had consciously rejected, was that men might function better if permitted to be human. The contrast became increasingly difficult to ignore as 1944 moved into 1945, and Yamamoto's captivity continued. News from Japan was limited, but occasionally available through camp newspapers and through conversations with interrogators. As the war turned ever more decisively against Japan, the tone of the news shifted. The Americans were losing fewer men. The Japanese were losing more. Eventually, the Americans would reach Japan itself. Japanese prisoners began to receive letters from home, mail that somehow made it across the war's boundaries through mechanisms that seemed miraculous in their efficiency. These letters, when they came, were marked by an increasing desperation. Food was scarce in Japan. Bombing was constant. Families were frightened. And they carried an implicit question that was almost too painful to articulate. In American captivity, was Yamamoto safer than his family was at home? This question troubled Yamamoto deeply. It suggested a universe that did not conform to the one he had been taught to understand. If Japanese soldiers were meant to be the protectors, the superior beings whose physical and moral discipline made them capable of bearing arms, then how? Had it come to pass that their families starved while Japanese prisoners of war in American camps ate 3 meals a day? The answer, when it came, was connected again to baseball. During the spring of 1945, as the Americans moved inexorably toward victory and the Japanese home islands became increasingly subject to direct bombardment, The camp organized what was being called a championship series. It was not official. Such a thing would have required paperwork and approval from multiple layers of command, but it had acquired a kind of sanctioned inevitability. The Eagles would play the Tigers for 4 games. The winner would be declared champions of Camp Shelby's Prisoner Baseball League. The games were attended by nearly the entire prisoner population, and by many of the American guards and support personnel. What had been a marginally tolerated recreation had become something like a festival, a break in the machinery of occupation, a moment when the normal rules of captivity seemed temporarily suspended. In the 3rd game of the series, with the Eagles, leading 2-1, Yamamoto came to bat in a situation that in American baseball terminology was called bases loaded. He did not know the term. He understood only that Sasaki pitching for the Tigers was likely to throw the ball close to his body, that there were men standing at various points in the field with their gloves ready, that the crowd of prisoners and guards had quieted to an intensity of attention that made the tropical heat seem even more oppressive. Sasaki wound up. The ball came toward Yamamoto at approximately the speed of all of Sasaki's previous pitches, which is to say at a speed that seemed designed to test reflexes rather than kill anyone. Yamamoto swung. The connection was solid. He felt it through the bat, through his hands, through his entire body. That perfect alignment of force and timing that required no analysis, no thought, that simply happened when a man was paying complete attention to something in the present moment. The ball flew, high, far, into the space beyond the outfielders where nothing could touch it until it landed, well beyond the boundaries of the field, in an area where groundskeepers theoretically maintained order but where victory resided for anyone who could send a ball traveling that distance. Yamamoto ran. The bases ran before him. Behind him, his teammates erupted. The entire prisoner population erupted. For a moment, the cheering was so loud that it seemed to shake the fences. And in that moment, standing between third base and home plate with dirt on his uniform and sweat on his face and joy, actual, uncomplicated joy, flooding through his chest, Takeshi Yamamoto forgot entirely that he was a prisoner, that his nation was defeated, that his family might be starving, that the world he had known before the war would never exist again. He simply was. A man who had done something well. A man among other men who were acknowledging his achievement. A man in a place where such things still mattered. When he reached home plate, his teammates greeted him with something like celebration, not the controlled, ritualized appreciation that Japanese military culture demanded, but genuine enthusiasm. They pounded his back. They grinned at him. One young private named Ito, barely 17 and a recent arrival at the camp, looked at him with an expression of pure admiration and said something that Yamamoto would remember for the rest of his life. "You looked like an American." The observation was meant as simple description, but it carried enormous weight. In the moment of hitting the home run, in the moment of running the bases and accepting the congratulations of his teammates, Yamamoto had indeed looked like an American. He had looked like a man who believed that such moments mattered, that they were worthy of effort and attention, that joy was not a sign of weakness or depravity, but something that strengthened rather than corrupted. The war ended 6 months later, in August 1945, with Japan's formal surrender. For weeks after, the prisoners lived in a strange, suspended state. The machinery of captivity continued. They still lived in barracks, still answered roll call, still worked on assigned details, but the rationale for the captivity had vanished. They were no longer dangerous enemies. They were simply men waiting to be repatriated. During this period, the baseball continued. If anything, it intensified. The games took on a new meaning, though no one articulated what that meaning was. They seemed to be, in retrospect, a way of maintaining connection to America while preparing to return to Japan, a way of processing the experience of captivity while holding on to the strange comfort it had come to represent. One final game was organized, a game between the combined forces of the prisoner population and the American guards. This was technically prohibited, but by August 1945, with the war conclusively over, such prohibitions seemed quaint, relics of a system that was itself becoming historical. The Americans organized themselves into a team led by Private Greenberg, who had spent much of the previous year watching prisoner games and who had learned enough about the sport to participate at an amateur level. They prepared with great seriousness, dividing their team carefully, discussing strategy, treating the game as if an international championship was at stake. The prisoners, too, organized carefully. They selected their best players. They practiced. They invested in the game an emotional intensity that far exceeded what the actual competition warranted. But everyone understood what they were doing. They were, through baseball, saying something to the Americans that could not be said in words. Something about respecting them, about having been changed by contact with them, about understanding that the categories of enemy and friend could be more complicated than the official narrative suggested. The game itself was close. The prisoners won 5-4 in a game that seemed designed by baseball gods to demonstrate that victory itself was less important than the competition, less important than the moment in which men worked together, understood the rules, executed skills, and accepted both triumph and defeat. When the final out was made, there was celebrating, but it was complicated celebrating. The prisoners celebrated their victory. The Americans celebrated their having played so well against opponents who had now, through the mechanisms of captivity and shared experience, become something between enemies and friends. Yamamoto stood in the center of the field, holding the baseball that had been the final out, gripped in the glove of an American soldier named Matthews, who had been positioned in the field. Matthews was a broad-faced man from Iowa, and when he came to shake Yamamoto's hand after the game was concluded, there were tears running down his face. "You taught us something," Matthews said in English that Yamamoto had learned enough of to partially understand. "You taught us that we're all the same underneath." Yamamoto did not respond because his English was insufficient, but he understood. Or rather, he understood something that transcended the specific words. What Matthews meant was that captivity and war, and the machinery of nations trying to kill each other, had created a space where men had nevertheless found a way to participate in something that was, in its essence, fundamentally human. 3 weeks later, Yamamoto boarded a ship bound for Japan. He was repatriated along with thousands of other Japanese prisoners, transported back to a nation that was itself being remade by American occupation. What he carried with him, in addition to his few possessions and the weight of trauma that would mark him for the rest of his life, was an understanding of America that no propaganda could have conveyed. When he returned to his family in Osaka, they were shocked. Not merely because he was alive, though there was that, but because he was healthy. He had gained weight. His teeth were intact. He had not been systematically tortured or slowly starved. Compared to their own experiences of the final years of the war, he had lived in what seemed like luxury. He tried to explain the camps to them. He tried to describe the food, the cleanliness, the medical care. Most importantly, he tried to describe the baseball. His family could not understand why this detail mattered. In the context of national defeat and personal suffering, the fact that he had been permitted to play a game seemed both irrelevant and somehow shameful. If he had been well treated by the Americans, did that not suggest something suspect about his loyalty? Had he somehow collaborated, even passively, by accepting his captivity without the resistance or the noble death that propaganda suggested was the proper response? Yamamoto could not fully answer these questions. But as the years passed and he began to understand the complexity of what had happened to him, he came to believe that baseball, that simple game played with a bat and ball and nothing else at stake but the moment itself, had been a kind of diplomatic language. It had communicated, across the barriers of nationality and language and wartime hatred, a message that transcended politics and ideology, that humans could organize their societies around pleasure as well as around power, around play as well as around production, around respect for another's skill even in the context of captivity. This understanding did not come to Yamamoto immediately. It took years of reflection, of watching baseball become increasingly popular in Japan during the American occupation, of understanding that the Americans were not merely imposing their will on the Japanese but were offering, in 1,000 small ways, a vision of how a society could function, and in all of those 1,000 small ways, in the cleanliness of the camps, the adequacy of the food, the access to medical care, The provision of recreational opportunities, baseball served as the most eloquent symbol. A symbol of a society that could be strong without being cruel, disciplined without being dehumanizing, organized without being totalitarian. After the war, Yamamoto lived quietly in Osaka, working in an electrical company, taking no particular prominence in public life, but he attended baseball games whenever possible. He followed Japanese professional baseball with the enthusiasm of a man who had learned, through captivity in an American camp, that watching men play a game could be one of the most profound pleasures available to human beings. In the 1960s, when American soldiers and Japanese civilians could mix relatively freely, Yamamoto sought out a baseball field where American servicemen were playing. He watched quietly from a distance, and when he saw a young American soldier hit a home run and run the bases with joy on his face, Yamamoto wept. Not because he mourned the war or regretted his captivity, though he did both, but because he saw in that young man's face the same thing he had seen in Private Greenberg's knot on the fence line at Camp Shelby decades before. The possibility that joy and strength could coexist, that humans could organize themselves around something other than domination and fear. When Japan and America eventually became allies, when bases were established throughout Japan, and American soldiers became permanent fixtures in Japanese communities, baseball became the language through which much of that relationship was expressed, not in formal diplomatic channels, but in the parks and fields where soldiers and civilians, American and Japanese, could gather together and participate in something that required no translation beyond understanding that a ball hit far is good, that running fast is good, that the moment of connection between bat and ball contains a kind of perfection that transcends nationality. For Takeshi Yamamoto, baseball had been a gateway to understanding that his enemy was not evil in its essence, merely different, organized according to different principles, built on different values. And while this understanding came to him through captivity, it ultimately gave him something precious: the ability to imagine that the world did not have to be organized the way he had been taught it should be, that nations did not have to be locked in eternal struggle, that men could indeed be permitted to play games in the afternoon and find meaning in the simple act of doing something well. The Coca-Cola Company, through its aggressive marketing during and after the war, would eventually convince much of the world that American values were identical to American products, that to drink Coke was to embrace American ideals. This was, in many respects, a distortion, but there was a kernel of truth in the equation. Just as Coca-Cola represented an abundance that transcended mere nutrition, baseball represented a vision of society that transcended mere survival. In both, what Japanese prisoners encountered in American captivity was not a defeated people resorting to distractions or a weak culture indulging in frivolity, but a fundamentally different organization of human society, one in which there was space for both discipline and joy, for both efficiency and play. When Yamamoto died in 1984 at the age of 66, his son found among his possessions a newspaper clipping from a 1945 copy of the camp newspaper announcing the championship baseball series. He also found, carefully wrapped in cloth and preserved with obvious devotion over 4 decades, a baseball bat, not the one Yamamoto had used to hit his famous home run. That had been left at the camp. But a bat that he had obtained shortly after returning to Japan, during the American occupation, when American servicemen had begun to teach Japanese civilians the rules of the game that had changed his life. The bat had never been used for its intended purpose. It had been preserved as an artifact, a symbol of a moment when 2 enemies had found a way to speak to each other across the barriers of language and nation and ideology. It had been preserved as evidence that such communication was possible, that captivity could contain unexpected grace, that the simplest acts, hitting a ball, running around a field, experiencing the moment when your body and mind align in perfect cooperation, could carry meanings far deeper than anyone who had not lived through war could possibly understand. This is the truth that Japanese prisoners learned in American camps, the truth that would eventually reshape their nation and their relationship to their captors, that a people who could afford to play baseball while fighting for their existence was a people who would, in the end, defeat any enemy who believed that strength could only be measured through cruelty. That abundance and joy were not luxuries to be eliminated by those seeking total commitment to war. but assets as valuable as any weapon, because they sustained something that no amount of military training could fully suppress: the human desire to live, to create, to achieve, and to celebrate that achievement with others.